This is Frank Gillard at General Bradley's headquarters. East and West have met. At 20 minutes to 5 on Wednesday afternoon, April the 25th, 1945, American troops made contact with Soviet elements of Marshal Konyev's 1st Ukrainian Army Group near the German town of Torgau on the Elbe. This is the news for which the whole Allied world has been waiting. The forces of liberation have joined hands.
The Second World War is almost over in Europe. Though allies, the troops come from two different worlds, the communist East and the capitalist West.
We were like brothers. We had defeated the enemy together. We were united in fighting fascism, and we'd won.
Alexander Silvashko and William Robertson are two of the first soldiers to meet.
The Americans gave us cigarettes, food. They gave us whatever they had, even watches as souvenirs. The atmosphere was unbelievable.
You must understand, we weren't able to really communicate with them except in sign language, and so you do the sort of things that people did. They were good people, and we had no problem getting along with the individual Russian soldiers that we met there at all. There was the relief that the war was coming now to a close, and that the Allies had won the war. We were just plain thankful that we were there and breathing.
The picture of Robertson and Silvashko together is seen around the world. Their meeting on the Elbe is a symbol for the post-war hopes of millions. Throughout the war years, they've been told they're fighting a people's war to protect their own way of life against fascist tyranny.
This is your victory. We have never seen a greater day than this.
This is a glorious hour. The flags of freedom fly all over Europe.
Война победоносно завершена. Германия полностью разгромлена.
Emerged from the ruins of Europe's cities, no one knew what the post-war map of Europe would look like. What was to become of us? Our beautiful city was flattened. For Berliners like 22-year-old Ilse Kruger, the immediate need was to rebuild their lives.
Und haben wir so Spitzhacken genommen, so, oder Hammer, was
we took picks and hammers, anything we could get hold of.
Da hatten und haben damit die Steine abgeklopft. Ja?
We cleaned up the bricks.
Und haben dann eine große,
and then we formed a great long line, passing them from hand to hand.
Nach dem anderen weitergereicht wurde.
They struggled to find food and shelter. But they also knew that the victorious Allies represented two fundamentally different systems. And their future depended on which they would have to live under.
Wir hatten ja Angst vor den Russen.
It was the Russians we were afraid of.
We
were dismayed when we realized the occupying powers would make all the decisions.
We
had to do what they told us. The occupying powers met near Berlin to come to final agreement on the new order. To ease Soviet fears that Germany might rise again, frontiers were redrawn, and millions of people were uprooted. Though the two sides were deeply suspicious of each other, the differences were glossed over.
This is the BBC Home Service. The Allies leave this conference, which has strengthened the ties between the three governments, with renewed confidence that their governments and peoples will ensure the creation of a just and enduring peace.
Free elections were promised. But in the countries where the Soviets had driven out the Germans, all key government posts were given to communists, whatever the feelings of the local population. In the euphoria of victory, Russian soldiers like Captain Anatoly Semiryaga were in no doubt what the future held.
Нас учили, что важнейшие последствия победы над фашизмом.
We were taught that the defeat of fascism was an important step towards the victory of socialism all over the world.
Если советские войска освободили эти страны,
Since the Red Army had liberated Eastern Europe, sooner or later socialism would be established there.
And for all the public displays of Allied unity, Russians stationed in Berlin were reminded the struggle was not over.
Нас собирают руководители наши и говорят,
We were called in by our officers and told, listen,
виновники той войны, в которой мы победили,
the Germans were not solely responsible for this war. It wasn't just Hitler,
это вся система
but the
империи.
whole imperialist system.
Понимаете, что значит? А кто является представителем
Imperialism was
системы?
responsible.
Вот сейчас.
And who are the representatives of
самые
imperialism now? The same
вместе с
allies with
которыми
whom we
мы
fought
воевали
together
против
against
Гитлера.
Hitler.
The recent Allies had their minds on other things.
When Johnny comes marching home upon this shore again, we'll pray that he'll never have to go to war again. Now we all know what Johnny did at war, but do you know what he did before? Won't you listen, listen? Johnny Jones was a choir boy, kind of shy, yes, and kind of coy. He shot down when the enemy prayed. Now he's back singing peace refrain.
It's like a new life. It's like walking from one scene of a tragedy into a musical.
Gail Halverson had spent 3 years in the Air Force.
Home, go back to see my girlfriend, plan for what I'm going to do after the war, back in the mountains of Utah. It just, all the worry and concern was just obliterated. And we disbanded our military. We just disbanded very rapidly. Now's the time for peace.
Civilian goods are already trickling from factories, and shortly washing machines and other luxuries we've missed will be pouring from the factories at 1942 prices. And with new cars and new tires on the way, America will be rolling with a pre-war flourish. Yes, cars, radios, vacuum cleaners, nylons, juicy steaks. It sounds almost like a dream.
In the spring of 1946, Winston Churchill traveled to the United States. He tried to shock Americans out of their complacency. In a speech at Fulton, Missouri, carried on radio, he warned them how the Soviets were acting in Europe.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe. Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Budapest. All these famous cities and the populations around them lie in what I must call the Soviet sphere.
Churchill's vivid picture of a continent divided by an iron curtain helped change the public mood. Once, the press had portrayed an alliance of 3 equals. Now, Uncle Joe was turned into a scheming despot, forcing whole countries into submission. From the east, Soviet cartoonists responded in kind. These crude caricatures were part of a new type of war in which governments taught whole populations to demonize the other. An American newsroom caught the new tone.
In the background was the growing struggle between two great powers to shape the post-war world. Soviet Russia was expansively stabbing westward, knifing into nations left empty by war. On orders from the Kremlin, Russia had launched one of history's most drastic political, moral, and economic wars, a Cold War. The United States was obliged to help Europe safeguard its traditional freedoms and the independence of its nations. Gone was the spirit of wartime unity that reached its peak on that historic afternoon in April '45 at the Elbe River in Germany. Here, two worlds actually met, but this coalition was to be torn asunder.
The Soviets also recalled a meeting on the Elbe. But their version showed a bloodthirsty American general bent on the domination of Europe.
Старая война окончилась. Началась новая. Война с коммунизмом.
Я вижу другие сны, господин генерал. Мне снится мир.
Пожалуйста. У нас свобода сновидений.
Я прекрасно помню фильм «Встреча на Эльбе».
I remember seeing the film Meeting on the Elbe.
Что где-то я там буду. Мне, конечно, было...
I thought I'd find my character played somewhere in it. I was terribly upset when I realized that it was completely untruthful.
Отражается жестокая неправда.
On leaving the army, Lieutenant Silvashko had become a schoolmaster. But now, his moment of fame was something better forgotten.
Атмосфера была страха.
Everyone lived in fear.
Мой рассказ о войне.
The children liked my tales of the war, but I never told them about the meeting on the Elbe.
Их не было. Если бы я действительно,
If I had discussed what had happened openly, I would have been in trouble.
То меня ж бы спросили, зачем...
I would have been pulled in and questioned by the secret police.
Ответ перед органами госбезопасности.
Ich hab so Heimweh nach dem Kurfürstendamm. Hab so ne Sehnsucht nach meinem Berlin.
Berlin remained under the joint control of the wartime Allies. Its western sector was an outpost of capitalism, deep inside the communist world. Moscow decided this could not go on.
Switches are pulled on generators, and the fuel famine forces drastic power cuts. Berlin becomes a city of darkness as all ground communication is severed and industry comes to a standstill.
In June 1948, with no warning, the Soviets shut off all the supply lines to Berlin which crossed their zone.
Она готовилась неделю. Мы делали все,
The blockade was prepared weeks in advance.
добровольно ушли.
We'd done everything we could to make the Allies leave West Berlin voluntarily,
Добровольно ушли. Потому что это было
because it was a
бельмо
mote in our
у нас
eye.
на глазу. Так считали. То мы решили
So in the end, we decided to force them to leave by making life intolerable for West Berlin.
для Западного Берлина.
Western leaders had watched passively as Eastern Europe fell under Soviet control. This time, they decided to act. Regardless of cost, they started to supply Berlin from the air. Experienced flyers were called back.
Telex came in and says, we went 40 airplanes to leave Mobile, Alabama, go to Frankfurt within 4 hours. And we want crews for that. And so I volunteered. We knew the dire straits that the people in Berlin were under. I was excited to join the airlift and brought along my 8mm camera. Oh, we're just coming out of the shower again, Pickering, my co-pilot. We'd fly all night and come back in the middle of the day and sleep in the middle of the day 6 hours and take off again, round the clock.
Month after month, the planes kept flying. To people in the West, the blockade confirmed all they'd been told about the Russians.
It seemed to me as we flew the airlift, it came right down to the basic level of comparison between good and evil.
Mit 250.000 Nettotonnen Gebrauchsgütern für die Berliner Bevölkerung. Diese kostbaren Ladungen nach Berlin zu bringen, mussten die Flugzeuge eine Strecke zurücklegen, die 1000 Mal die Erde reicht.
Через каждые 10 минут.
One landed every 10 minutes.
Вы понимаете, какое наше впечатление, какое было настроение? И над домами, где мы...
The planes flew low over our rooms and the officers' quarters in Karlshorst. Those enormous planes 100 meters above us.
100, 150, 200 метров.
Beginning his own private propaganda campaign, Captain Halverson parachuted chocolate bars to the children of Berlin.
Was ich jetzt persönlich erlebt habe, war, dass etwas herunterschwebte.
Something was floating down, and many of the children knew what it was.
Und die flitzten, die rannten. Und ich dachte, naja, gut, was
Everyone
ist
was
das?
running, and I was thinking, what is it? What's going on? And I started running. But there were only a few parachutes, so I didn't get one.
Habe ich noch nichts bekommen. Da habe ich mich entschlossen.
So then I wrote to the chocolate uncle at Tempelhof Airport.
Flughafen Tempelhof.
A little girl wrote me, her name is Mercedes. Now she says, when you see the white chickens, drop it there. I don't care if it scares them. Well, I looked for him and I couldn't find him. I dropped all over the approach. I had my buddies in the squadron drop another letter. Look, you guys are missing this all the time. So finally I gave up on her. I took a big package of gum and candy to Berlin and mailed it to Mercedes.
Als ich dann so das erste Stückchen Schokolade von der Tafel.
This was the first piece of chocolate I'd had.
Schokoladenonkel.
From the chocolate uncle.
So abbiss.
And when I bit into it, it was heaven on earth.
Himmel auf Erden, ne?
Midnight of Wednesday, the 11th of May, 1949. The blockade of Berlin is due to end as crowds gather at the Russian-British frontier.
The Soviet climb-down turned a major crisis for the West into a triumph. In the East, people knew nothing of this. Their only task was to follow the leader. Millions were persuaded that central planning and collective labor were the only road to prosperity and a just society. And their governments assured them they were the envy of the world.
Jeder von uns wurde von Erregung gepackt, als hörte oder erlebte, wie Westdeutschlands Jugend die Zonengrenzen sprengte. Auf diesen Augenblick hatten sie gewartet. Diesen Weg konnte ihnen kein USA-Soldat und kein Bonner Polizist verlegen.
And when China went communist in 1949, the Soviet Union could trumpet the inevitability of world revolution.
Теперь на 1/4 земного шара возникло могучее содружество народов социалистических стран. Теперь каждый третий человек живет и трудится при социализме. Теперь нас больше миллиарда.
On Stalin's 70th birthday, the people were called out to celebrate the onward march of communism. The leader watched Tamara Bankietik come forward.
Мы Ленина внуки и Сталина внуки. Мы бодро шагаем к вершинам науки. Мы знаем, работать придется.
Я попала из своей жизни просто в сказку. I was transported into a fairy tale.
Взгляд был прикован.
I had eyes only for him.
Мне казались такие добрые, необыкновенные.
He had such kindly eyes. It was as if he was my father. I just wanted to touch him.
Хотя бы прикоснуться.
И друг любимый, родному Сталину!
Tamara was 11 at the time, and like the girl in the fairy tale, when the ball was over, she had to hand back her dress. The way most Soviet people lived had little to do with the picture painted by the party elite.
We lived in terrible conditions. It wasn't a house, but a little shed. There was no running water or electricity. Each day I only had money for one ration of bread. I had to fight myself to stop eating it before I got home and shared it with my mother.
Inside this closed world, information about the West was totally controlled.
Ложью и клеветой заполнены столбцы реакционных американских газет. Каков же этот хваленный образ жизни? Посмотрите на их искусство. Посмотрите на их спорт. Посмотрите на эту борьбу в вольноамериканском стиле. Посмотрите, как ухаживает за собачкой миллионера и как безработные стоят в очереди за бурдой.
У нас была страна справедливая, так нас учили. We knew our society was just, and that capitalism was terrible, and people were exploited. That's what we were taught. It didn't matter how badly I lived now, I hoped it would get better. I believed in Stalin and knew that life would improve.
Юные ленинцы, до борьбы за справу Ленина, Сталина, будьте готовы!
From childhood, citizens were constantly reminded of the sacrifices of the Great Patriotic War. 20 million had died, and it must never happen again. Over 70% of the country's budget went into making the Soviet Union a superpower. Defense was the watchword. All over Eastern Europe, communist governments mounted show trials of so-called traitors to instill fear.
Před státním soudem v Praze byla souzena 8členná banda amerických špionů a terorystů.
Przed wojskowym sądem rejonowym w Warszawie stanęli członkowie antypaństwowego i antyludowego ośrodka, którzy na zlecenie...
Americká plutokracie cynicky šlape po všech zásadách mezinárodního práva a diplomatických vztahů.
W łańcuchu bezpośrednich przygotowań do napaści na Polskę, na Związek Radziecki, na kraje demokracji ludowej. W łańcuchu
žádám pro všechny obviněné trest smrti. Nechť váš rozsudek dopadne jako železná pěst, bez nejmenšího slitování.
Thousands were executed. Millions of others were sent to prison camps, all in the name of the people.
Можно мне вас поцеловать, товарищ Сталин? За все! За все, что вы сделали для нашего народа! Для нас! Отец Сталин!
Ива Сталин! И внутрь Сталин!
Мира и счастья всем вам, друзья мои!
Feito de Vitória, fala sobre as vantagens de quem acertou as contas públicas na hora de encarar esses tempos de aperto econômico.